On the 15th of June 2026, in a stadium in Atlanta, Georgia, a football team called the Blue Sharks walked onto a pitch to face Spain, one of the greatest footballing nations in history, 3-time European champions, 1-time world champions. The Blue Sharks are from Cape Verde, and for 120 million people watching across the world who asked themselves, where is that? This episode is the answer. Cape Verde is an archipelago, a cluster of 10 volcanic islands, sitting in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 600 miles off the westernmost point of Africa. The islands are small. The largest, Santiago, is about the size of the English county of Nottinghamshire. The entire country has a land area of about 4,000 square kilometers, smaller than the state of Delaware, smaller than the English Lake District, roughly the same size as Mallorca. Its population is approximately 500,000 people. For context, the city of Atlanta, where they play their opening World Cup match, has a larger metropolitan population than the entire country they came from. And yet, Cape Verde is at the World Cup, one of the smallest nations ever to qualify for the tournament, the only African country making its World Cup debut in 2026, a national team that beat Cameroon away from home during qualifying. A country that has produced a Grammy Award-winning musical genre recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. A nation whose diaspora, the Cape Verdeans living abroad, is larger than the population of the islands themselves. More people with Cape Verdean heritage live outside Cape Verde than live on its islands. Their community stretches from Boston to Rotterdam to Lisbon to Dakar. The Blue Sharks squad reflects that global scatter, players who grew up in Portugal, in France, in the United States, in the Gulf, all united by a flag that represents 10 islands most of the world had never thought about until a June day in Atlanta. Today, for everyone who watches that match and asks, who are these people? This is the full story. The Portuguese navigators who found the islands empty and decided to fill them with enslaved people. The Creole culture that grew from that violence and became something entirely its own. The famines that killed tens of thousands and drove Cape Verdeans to the whaling ships of New England. The independence won against the longest odds. The barefoot woman from a Mindelo bar who became the most famous African voice in the world. And the October afternoon in 2025 when a country of 500,000 people qualified for the World Cup for the first time and wept in the streets of Praia. In the mid-15th century, European navigators were pushing further and further south and west, trying to find new routes to gold, spices, and the riches of Asia. Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, was funding and directing these expeditions, and his explorers were gradually working their way down the African coast and out into the Atlantic. Sometime between 1455 and 1462, the exact date and the question of who arrived first remain debated by historians. Portuguese and Genoese explorers found a cluster of volcanic islands sitting in the Atlantic, roughly 600 miles west of the African coast near what is now Senegal. The islands were uninhabited. There is no evidence of any prior human settlement. The navigators had found, in the middle of an ocean, a genuinely empty world. In 1462, Portuguese settlers arrived on Santiago, the largest island, and founded a settlement they called Ribeira Grande. Today it is known as Cidade Velha, Old City, and it holds the distinction of being the first permanent European settlement in the tropics anywhere in the world. 30 years before Columbus reached the Americas, Europeans were already building a town, a church, and eventually a cathedral on a volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic. The climate was difficult, arid, windswept, prone to drought, with thin volcanic soils that made conventional agriculture unreliable. The islands were not blessed with the lush fertility of Madeira or São Tomé, but they had something far more valuable in the age of Atlantic expansion: position. Cape Verde sat at the intersection of three worlds. Sailing south from Europe, you stopped at Cape Verde. Sailing west to Brazil or the Caribbean, Cape Verde was your last landfall. Sailing up the African coast with enslaved people, Cape Verde was where you watered your ships, reprovisioned, and prepared your human cargo for the crossing. In 1466, Portugal granted Cape Verde exclusive trading rights along the West African coast. The stretch from modern Senegal to Guinea-Bissau, one of the most productive human trafficking zones in the Atlantic world. Ribeira Grande became the most important slave trading port in the Atlantic for over a century, the first city in the tropics, and the first major staging post for the horror that would define the next 3 centuries. At the height of the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 3,000 enslaved people passed through Cape Verde every year. The islands of Santiago and Fogo hosted sugar and cotton plantations. Enslaved people were brought from the West African mainland, from the peoples of what are now Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, and held on the islands before being shipped onward to the Americas. Tens of thousands were exported directly to northern Brazil. The islands also developed their own enslaved population to work the plantations and produce the panos, the beautiful cotton cloths woven on narrow looms that became a prized currency in the slave trade itself. By 1580, on Santiago alone, there were 14,000 enslaved people to 2,000 free people. The demographic transformation was total. But here is where Cape Verde's story diverges from almost every other slave society in the Atlantic world, and where something extraordinary began to emerge. The Portuguese who came to Cape Verde were not wealthy settlers bringing families from Lisbon. They were traders, adventurers, exiles, people sent away from Portugal for various infractions, criminals, outcasts, Jewish families fleeing the Inquisition. They were not interested in maintaining social distance from the enslaved and freed people around them. The islands were too small, too isolated, too difficult for formal colonial hierarchy to hold. Over generations, a new kind of people emerged, mixed heritage, neither fully African nor fully European, speaking neither Portuguese nor any single West African language, but a new language, Creole, that blended elements of Portuguese grammar and vocabulary with West African phonology, tone, and rhythm. Wearing neither European dress nor West African cloth, but a new aesthetic that combined both. Practicing a Catholicism inflected with West African spiritual sensibilities. A people who owed their existence to a crime, the slave trade, but who had made of that crime something that belonged to no one who had committed it, something entirely their own. Scholars call this process Creolisation, the cultural synthesis that occurs when radically different peoples are forced together and produce over generations a new culture that belongs to none of its constituent parts. Cape Verde is one of the most studied examples of Creolisation in the world. Its language, its music, its food, its social organization, all of it is a living laboratory of what happens when Africa and Europe collide in an isolated Atlantic archipelago over 5 centuries. The Portuguese who ran Cape Verde understood, to some degree, what they had created, and they used it. Cape Verdean Creole people, occupying a middle position in the colonial hierarchy, were deployed as interpreters, traders, and administrators across Portuguese Africa. They were the go-betweens of empire, fluent in African languages and European protocols, at home in neither world and indispensable to both. If Cape Verde's colonial past was defined by the slave trade, its post-slavery history was defined by a different kind of violence: drought. In 1747, the islands were hit by the first of a series of devastating droughts. The volcanic soil, already thin and prone to erosion from overgrazing and deforestation, could not sustain the population through years of failed rainfall. Famines became recurring catastrophes. 3 major droughts in the 18th and 19th centuries killed more than 100,000 people, in a population that at its peak was only around 300,000. That is not a marginal tragedy. That is the periodic elimination of a third of the country's people. The Portuguese response, for the most part, was indifference. Investment in the islands was minimal. Food aid was absent. During the famines of 1941 to 1943 and 1947 to 1948, the worst of the 20th century, an estimated 45,000 people died. The Portuguese authorities forbade reporting on the deaths. The word famine was banned in the press. Half the population of Fogo Island perished. No food aid arrived. Portugal was focused on its war and its empire. Cape Verde was simply expected to manage, and so Cape Verdeans left, in waves, over centuries, driven by famine, drought, and poverty. The first significant emigration came via whaling ships. From the late 18th century, whaling ships from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, from New Bedford, from Nantucket, from Providence, regularly put in at Cape Verde's ports, particularly at Brava and Fogo Islands. They needed crew. Cape Verdean men knew the Atlantic currents, the winds, the sea. They were experienced ocean people, and they needed to leave. The match was perfect. Cape Verdean men boarded American whaling ships by the thousands. When the ships returned to New Bedford, many of the crew stayed. They sent money home. They brought family members over. They established communities in the old port towns of southern New England. In New Bedford today, the whaling capital of the 19th century, Cape Verdeans and their descendants make up one of the oldest and most established immigrant communities in the city. The Cape Verdean Independence Day Parade in New Bedford, celebrated every July 5th, is one of the longest-running ethnic celebrations in New England. The diaspora kept expanding. After the whaling era, Cape Verdeans went to Portugal, to the Netherlands. Rotterdam became home to a significant community. And to France. Cape Verdean men were recruited as laborers in São Tomé and Príncipe. Cape Verdean women worked in domestic service across Europe. The emigration never stopped because the drought never stopped, and the poverty never stopped, and the Portuguese never invested sufficiently for the islands to sustain the people who lived on them. By independence in 1975, and certainly by today, more people with Cape Verdean heritage lived outside the islands than on them. The diaspora is estimated at between 800,000 and 1 million people, against a home population of approximately 600,000. Cape Verde is, in the truest sense, a transnational nation, a country that exists not just on 10 Atlantic islands, but in the memory and the music and the remittances of people scattered across the whole world. There is a word in Cape Verdean Creole that does not have a precise English equivalent. The word is Sodade, derived from the Portuguese saudade, but Cape Verdeans will tell you it is not quite the same. Saudade is nostalgia, a longing for what was. Sodade is something more specific and more oceanic. It is the longing of departure, the feeling of the horizon when the boat has already left the dock and the islands are getting smaller behind you, and you know you may not see them again for years or ever. It is the emotion of the diaspora, of a people whose history is an endless series of leave-takings and who carry with them across the world the ache of the islands they left. Sodade is the emotional center of Morna, the national music of Cape Verde. And Morna may be the most precise musical expression of a collective historical experience that any culture has ever produced. Morna emerged in the 19th century, shaped by the blend of African rhythms, Portuguese song traditions, and influences carried across the Atlantic from Brazil and the Caribbean. Early Morna was lighter, sometimes humorous, but in the hands of the poet and composer Eugenio Tavares, born on Brava Island in the late 19th century, considered the greatest lyricist in Morna's history, it became a deeply literary form, centered on love, separation, and Sodade. In the 1920s, the composer B. Lisa incorporated Brazilian guitar techniques, adding harmonic sophistication that shaped the sound we recognize today. The instruments are intimate: guitar, cavaquinho, a small four-stringed instrument, violin, sometimes piano or clarinet. The setting is always small: a bar, a salon, a dim room late at night, music for people who have just arrived from somewhere or are about to leave. For most of the 20th century, Morna was exactly what it sounds like: local, intimate, known only to Cape Verdeans, and small circles in Portugal and the Netherlands. Beautiful but invisible to the world, that changed because of one woman. Cesaria Evora was born in 1941 in Mindelo, on the island of São Vicente, Cape Verde's cultural capital, a port town with a rich musical tradition. She grew up in poverty, began singing in bars at 16, and spent decades performing for local audiences relatively unknown outside the islands. She gave up music at one point because it could not pay enough to raise her children. Then, in 1985, she was invited to record for an album of Cape Verdean women's music. She began performing again. In 1987, a French music producer heard her in a Lisbon restaurant and brought her to Paris. In 1988, she released her first international album, La Diva aux pieds nus, the Barefoot Diva. named for her habit of performing without shoes, which she said was simply for comfort and which became one of the most recognizable images in world music. In 1992, she released Miss Perfumado, featuring a song called Sodade. It sold over 300,000 copies in France alone. For a woman in her 50s, singing in a language most of the world had never heard, from an island most of the world could not have found on a map, the scale of this success was almost surreal. She went on to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York, at the Olympia in Paris, at venues across Japan, Brazil, Australia. In 2004, she won a Grammy Award for Best Contemporary World Music Album. Cesaria Evora did not just win a Grammy. She put Cape Verde on the map for millions of people who had no other reason to know the islands existed. She was the first ambassador the islands ever had, who the world actually listened to. Through her voice, people in Tokyo and London and Sao Paulo felt Sodade for a place they had never been, the longing of departure from an island they had never seen. That is what great art does. It makes the specific universal. She died in Mindelo in December 2011. The government declared 2 days of national mourning. The Cape Verde International Airport on São Vicente now bears her name, and Morna was inscribed on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2019, an international acknowledgement that one small island nation's music of longing belongs to the whole human family. Cabo Verde was under Portuguese colonial rule for over 500 years. The independence movement that finally ended that rule was led by one of the most remarkable figures in African political history, Amilcar Cabral. Cabral was born in 1924 in Guinea-Bissau, then also a Portuguese colony, to Cape Verdean parents. He studied in Portugal, trained as an agronomist, returned to Guinea-Bissau to conduct an agricultural survey of the country, and used that survey as an opportunity to learn, village by village, the conditions of colonial life. What he found convinced him that only political independence would change them. In 1956 in Bissau, he co-founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, the PAIGC. The party's name reflects Cabral's central political insight. The two territories shared a common origin. The enslaved people brought to Cape Verde had come largely from the coast of Guinea-Bissau. The islands and the mainland were, in his analysis, part of one people separated by colonialism. Their independence should be sought together. From 1963, PAIGC launched a guerrilla war against Portuguese rule, fought in Guinea-Bissau's forests and wetlands. The actual fighting never reached Cape Verde, which was protected by its position in the middle of the Atlantic from the kind of terrain-based insurgency possible on the mainland. But Cape Verdeans joined the struggle, fought in Guinea-Bissau, and provided the PAIGC's intellectual leadership. By the early 1970s, PAIGC controlled 2/3 of Guinea-Bissau's territory. Then, on the 20th of January 1973, Cabral was assassinated in Conakry, Guinea, killed by an infiltrator acting, most historians believe, on behalf of Portuguese intelligence. He was 48 years old. He never saw the independence he had worked for, but he had already changed everything. The PAIGC continued under his brother Luis Cabral. Guinea-Bissau declared independence unilaterally in September 1973. And then something happened in Portugal itself that accelerated the whole of African decolonization. The Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974. Portuguese military officers, exhausted by the unwinnable colonial wars in Africa, staged a coup in Lisbon. The 40-year dictatorship of the Estado Novo fell in a single day. Soldiers walked through Lisbon with red carnations in their rifle barrels. The Portuguese Empire began to dissolve. On the 5th of July 1975, at a ceremony in Praia, Portugal handed over power to Cape Verde. Aristides Pereira, the PAIGC's Secretary-General and one of Cabral's closest comrades, became the first president of the Republic. Pedro Pires became the first prime minister. After 513 years of Portuguese rule, Cape Verde was free. Since independence, Cape Verde has built one of the most successful democracies in Africa. It transitioned to multi-party democracy in 1991. Its elections have been consistently free and fair. The Economist Intelligence Unit regularly ranks it as one of the most democratic countries in Africa and the developing world. A nation born from the slave trade, shaped by famine and colonialism, freed after centuries of occupation, and now, by almost any measure of governance and human development, a quiet success story on the Atlantic horizon. On the 13th of October 2025, at the Estadio Nacional in Praia, Cape Verde's national football team completed a 3-0 home win over Eswatini. Simultaneously, Cameroon, their main group rivals, drew in their match. The mathematics resolved in Cape Verde's favor. For the first time in the history of football, a national team representing 500,000 people had qualified for the FIFA World Cup. The defender, Stapira, the team's captain, who has played across Europe and the Gulf, described the moment before the match. "I was supposed to have a pre-game nap, but one of the other players got out the speakers and started playing music. We all started dancing. It's like we knew that everything was going to be okay. It had to be our day." It was their day. And the celebrations that followed were described as the biggest Cape Verde had seen since independence itself. In Praia, in Mindelo, on every island, people poured into the streets. In Boston, in Brockton, in New Bedford, the oldest Cape Verdean communities in America, flags went up and the restaurants stayed open all night. In Rotterdam, in Lisbon, across the diaspora, Cape Verdeans who had never expected to watch their national team at a World Cup called home to parents and grandparents and wept. At the World Cup draw in Washington, D.C., Cape Verde learned their group. They would face Spain, Germany, and Georgia. The odds were immediately clear, but Roberto Lopes, the defender who plays in Ireland and was born to an Irish mother and Cape Verdean father, and who will become the first League of Ireland player to appear at a World Cup, said exactly the right thing. "It will be a party whether we win, lose, or draw. We'll just be celebrating the fact we can play on such a big stage." That sentence contains everything you need to understand about Cape Verde's relationship to this moment. For a country that has spent 500 years being used by others as a trading post, as a slave depot, as a refueling station, as a colonial afterthought, just being on that stage, just arriving in Atlanta in their dark blue shirts, just walking out onto a World Cup pitch for the first time in history, that is already a victory. That is already more than anyone promised them. Cape Verde should not exist. That sounds harsh, but it is the literal truth. It was a set of empty volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean, populated for the express purpose of running the most brutal commercial enterprise in human history. Its people were created, assembled from the wreckage of the slave trade, from the refuse of the Portuguese Empire, from the poverty and the violence and the enforced mixing of people who had no reason to be in the same place at the same time, except that a colonial power had put them there. And from that specific wreckage, they made a language, a music, a culture, a cuisine, an identity so distinctive that UNESCO felt compelled to preserve it, that a barefoot woman from a Mindelo bar could carry it to Carnegie Hall, that 500,000 people on a set of volcanic islands in the middle of the Atlantic produced a diaspora of 1 million who circle the globe like a constellation, all still oriented toward home. Cape Verde is, in the deepest sense, what humanity does with the worst that can be done to it. It is a living argument against despair. It is proof that culture is not inherited. It is made every generation out of whatever materials are at hand, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things are made from the most unlikely materials in the most isolated places by people who were given no reason to survive and yet insisted on not just surviving but on singing. Now you know who Cape Verde is. Not just the team in the dark blue shirts who faced Spain in Atlanta, but the people behind the shirts. The descendants of enslaved people who created something beautiful from their captivity, the survivors of famines that Portugal refused to acknowledge, the whalers who sailed to New Bedford and never came back, the barefoot woman who sang Sodade in the bars of Mindelo until someone in Paris was wise enough to listen, the diaspora that has carried the islands across the whole world. The Blue Sharks play their first World Cup match with 500 years of history behind them and a planet full of Cape Verdeans watching. However the tournament ends for them, however many goals are scored, however far they go, none of it changes what October the 13th, 2025 already gave them. They arrived. They belonged. and the world finally learned where Cape Verde is. Tell me in the comments, had you heard of Cape Verde before the World Cup? And if you are Cape Verdean, wherever in the world you are watching this, tell me what this moment means to your family. I want to hear the diaspora's voice in the comments of this video. This is Kingdoms and Empires. Every team at this World Cup has a history. This one will astonish you. Subscribe. We have 8 more African nations to introduce you to, and every single one of them has a story the world should know.